This is a conversation that has the incredible scope of imagining many possible futures for mobility and mobilities at a time when, as a society, we are faced with transparent and an urgent need to re-envisage them. As London surges out of a third lockdown, experiences and perceptions of stuckness, blockage, and mobility are at the forefront of everyone's minds and our bodies. Fewer planes, emptier buses, packed parks, these experiences of changing pathways and more intimate and local ranges of mobility are at once also magnified by global events such as the blockage of the Suez Canal by the container ship Ever Given, which in size larger than the Empire State Building cost more than $400 million per hour in delayed goods. As giants block our trafficways, meanwhile, the extreme mobility of non-human entities such as COVID-19 virus overwhelms our senses of speed. Could these blockages, transmissions, reconceived mobilities be gradually shifting perceptions of the city as a place of hustle, bustle, and movement driven by the capitalist aims of industry? And if so, to what are they shifting? The restrictions of pandemic conditions, while seemingly sticking us in place, have allowed for methods of transport powered by our own bodies to become much more visible. For example, by foot, by wheelchair, by cycle around our neighborhoods, just as mobilities of technology and of imagination become activated to connect us, including those of us who are shielding and quarantining with each other through new forms of conversation, art making, teaching and learning, protest, conviviality, and mourning. Transport and mobility in cities like London are facing rapid and profound transformation with, for example, the London Mayor's Office aiming for 80% of all Londoners' trips to be made by foot, by cycle, or by public transport by 2041. Meanwhile, social mobility is in decline in the UK, according to the Social Mobility Commission of 2020. The Guardian reported that, quote, of those surveyed, 44% agreed that where a person ends up in society was largely determined by their background. Only 35% felt that everyone had a fair chance to get on, unquote. The demographics of British engineers today reflect persistent blockages to mobility. Only 27% of engineers identify as people of color, and the UK has the lowest percentage of female engineering professionals in Europe at only 9%. As such, this evening's panel will ask what sustainable development of mobility looks like in a field of engineering for systems of transport, and also at the state of the profession for current and future engineers who work within British transport. What is the relationship between mobility and social mobility currently in the engineering profession? We will consider how to make opportunities for moving up in the field of engineering more sustainable, as well as how engineering can subvert or tackle cultural and socioeconomic biases that impact how people are asked to move within the city. How can future generations meet a wide range of needs in transport engineering? So without further ado, let me mobilize this panel. I'm delighted to welcome our guests who will bring a wealth of insights with them to this conversation. I'm going to introduce and talk to them each in turn for around 8 to 10 minutes. And then we will open up to the conversation to the speakers, and of course to respond to any questions or comments you might want to add through the Q&A channel. So please do join the conversation and feel free to post your responses as we go along. So I'm first going to turn to our first speaker, Dr. Petra Szilágyi, who is lecturer in functional materials at Queen Mary's School of Engineering and Material Science. In 2020, Petra was honored by the Women's Engineering Society as one of the top 50 engineers making significant contribution within sustainability. Her focus on energy and sustainability has led Dr. Szilágyi to carry out research in topics ranging from green methods to remove dyes from wastewaters to hydrogen storage. Currently, she leads the Advanced Functional Hybrid Materials Research Group at Queen Mary and is also an academic advisor on the university's new Center for Urban Transport Technology, which Dr. Jun Chen will also be speaking about a little later on in the panel. So Petra, can you describe your research? And a question I have asked each of the panelists to consider, what does mobility mean to you? How do you approach mobility in your research?
Thank you, Molly, for the kind introduction and also for the invitation. And I'm very happy that my name wasn't translated into salami. It was only this far away from it. So I would like to first specify my involvement with mobility. It's actually, or my research's involvement with mobility, and this is actually quite specific. So we're looking at materials. So I myself, as a materials chemist engineer, my group are developing materials that can enable greener transport technologies. So that would mean particularly vehicular applications, such as development of new types of batteries or materials as battery components, as well as fuel cell components. So this would potentially enable greener transport technologies. So in terms of my research, obviously, that's where my involvement comes from. So a little bit more about my research. So I already mentioned that I work with materials. So in my group, we develop sustainable approaches to make materials and use them for sustainability purposes, specifically for energy and environmental applications. And you might wonder about the name of my group. So it's quite a mouthful, so Advanced Functional Hybrid Materials. So just a little bit, I suppose advanced materials kind of speaks for itself. It means it's very expensive. And so what I mean by hybrid is that this kind of material, which are metal organic frameworks mostly I'm interested in, they're made up of building blocks which are very different in nature in terms of their chemistry. And we call them functional because we're engineering them with a particular purpose and with a particular application in mind. And in this case is either fuel synthesis or as materials for battery or fuel cell applications. So these materials are, I don't know if I can briefly introduce them a little bit or if I have time for that, but they're very interesting because they are crystalline and porous. And just to give you a little idea of what I mean by this, is that, so you can imagine these pieces of Lego, for example. So what crystallinity means is that you take identical pieces of Lego and you just extend them in 3 dimensions. And every single piece of Lego would represent the same bunch of molecules. And this repetitiveness in the 3 dimension gives this crystalline nature to materials. And essentially it assembles into the crystals that we know as sugar crystals or salt crystal. That's the origin of it. And it's similar, and it's kind of deliberate that I chose the analogy of the Lego pieces, because when you flip them around, there is a cavity inside, and that is very well determined in shape and size. And similarly to this, my materials also are porous, and the pores themselves are also well determined in shape and size in these type of materials. The only difference, I would say, not the only difference, one of the main differences is that these pores actually are very tiny. So they're on the nanometer level and beyond. And to give you an idea of what a nanometer is, or a bit of sense of scale, is that if you imagine the distance between Earth and Moon and multiply it by 3, if you compare that with 1 meter, this is how 1 nanometer compares with a meter. So it's actually very tiny. And you already mentioned the COVID virus a couple of times. So it's also about 500 times smaller than 1 virus. So these are very small entities. And what we do is we use these spaces. They're not public spaces, but they are spaces themselves. And we put guests inside And what we're looking at essentially is, because it's this small size of the pores, it's essentially the same scale or very comparable scale as atoms, that we can engineer the shape and size of gas particles with atomic precision. And furthermore, they can also interact with the pore walls, so we can really fine-tune the properties of these particles that we add as gas inside the pores of our materials. And this is what we actually exploit for synthesis of chemicals such as fuels, as well as as battery materials, particularly electrolytes and in fuel cells.
Petra, it's fascinating. This is fascinating. I wanted to ask about this a bit further, in the sense that it's so the generation of these crystalline cells comes from repurposing waste matter. Is that correct?
So indeed, yeah, sorry.
No, no.
Yeah, indeed. So this is something that we're looking at. So I mentioned at the beginning that we're looking at making these materials sustainably, and this is what I meant by it. Because one of the biggest impediments for the commercialization of these technologies is actually the cost of these materials, and also so not only the monetary cost of them, but also the environment and the energy cost of their production. So we're trying to mitigate this a little bit, and using waste materials as the feedstock essentially for the synthesis of these. So we particularly use plastic waste. Most specifically, we use the PET bottles that you would be all familiar with from the plastic bottles. So we use that as the sort of the source of one of the components, of one of the building blocks I previously mentioned, to synthesize these materials, in the hope that obviously this would make their production much cheaper.
And how many PET bottles are you working with currently, or is it like it's at a very early stage where you're kind of testing the plastics, or are you vastly kind of bringing in bottles from everywhere?
Unfortunately, at the moment, we may have converted, if we're lucky, we may have converted one bottle into something more useful. But we are working on particularly on diversifying, so just to make sure that it's not just one type of material we can make out of this, but we can add all sorts of functionalities to them. Ideally, just by what we call it one-pot synthesis. So that means that you just chuck everything into the same container, stick it in the oven, and then it comes out. And yeah, so this is what we're working on at the moment, to find a very simple way of making these out of waste.
Fantastic. Petra, one thing that I've noticed about your research and your career so far is that you really move across lots of different research communities. So you've undertaken research throughout Europe, but also in Australia, and some projects in Japan and in the United States. And I wondered if you would talk about what the influence of that is on your approach to research, and perhaps if there's a multidisciplinary aspect to the way you conduct research.
Yes, I think one thing I can say for sure, because I lived in various countries, is that you get to really appreciate how much climate change is really a global phenomenon. I mean, it sounds trivial, but when you travel around the world and you see every place being impacted by it, that is quite stunning, and I think it's quite remarkable. And I think one thing for me that's very striking is that, because I lived in many places, you get to see how local and domestic policies and politics affect how people react. And I think it is very important when we talk about sustainability to look at both sort of bigger policies as well as individual behavior, or how they affect each other. And I think it is quite stunning to see how different societies react to these challenges differently. So for example, obviously we already discussed a little bit about waste. So when you go about in the streets in Japan, there are no bins anywhere, yet there is no litter either. And that is because people just carry their rubbish well and then dispose of it when they get to home. And when you ask, because I have asked Japanese people about this, and they would say that, oh, when they're in middle school, they would be taught that they have to be respectful towards others. So I think it is very important to look at the effect of education as well as local and domestic policies.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you as well about what you think about some of the more globally contrived policies. For example, UNESCO's Sustainable Development Goals, and also perhaps the net zero carbon program. What your thoughts are on those goals and how well they're being actualized, and if there's anything that you would change or move forward differently?
Well, of course, there's always loads of things I would be changing. But I think that they're both very important, and they're at the heart of both of those goals. That there is really good thoughts and things that we would need to follow up on. But I think particularly in the case of the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, there is a quite a little bit clearer situation, because to me, and to come back at the introduction as well to what mobility means, is you did mention that there is two parts to it. So there is obviously the actual physical mobility of things, of transport, etc. But at the same time, there is the aspect of societal mobility as well. The thing, particularly in this latter case, it is important to realize that it actually should go in both ways. And I think the problem to some extent with both of these initiatives or policies is that both of them only take into consideration kind of an upwards move. Whereas I think when it comes to societal mobility, if people are moving up, there will be necessarily people that are moving down, and this is something that's as a kind of a taboo, and we're not supposed to talk about it. But I think we have to recognize, and we have to talk about this, that this thing exists. And I think particularly with the Sustainable Development Goals, to me personally, but obviously don't speak for the whole research community, there is a little bit of a contradiction, because so at the end of the day, of course, we can have sustainable development, but that we can't just keep on growing without impacting the environment. So there is a little bit of contradiction between sustainability and development. And I myself work a tiny bit on electric cars, as I mentioned before. So this is an example of it, that obviously when you're thinking about buying a new car, it's better to buy an electric car or a fuel cell vehicle than it is an engine vehicle. It's less bad for the environment. But let's not forget that the manufacturing of these cars also causes a lot of damage to the environment. So you need to mine the materials they're made up of. You need to input energy into the processing of the materials, into their the transporting of the pieces, into the assembling, and of course the whole car needs to kind of operate on some degree of energy. And even if you derive it all from sustainable resources, even the solar panel and the wind turbine, they need to be made out of something, and they need to be installed. So of course, I think my point is a little bit that we need to also analyze a little bit how we behave, and whether or not all the consumption that we think is as necessary as we think it is.
Brilliant, Petra. Thank you so much. And we'll come back to discussing some of these ideas at the end here. And actually, how we move through space, how we use resources and manage those, is part of the research interest for our next speaker, Dr. Jun Chen, who works on mobilities at designing transport flow. Dr. Chen is a senior lecturer in engineering science at Queen Mary. He works within aerospace engineering and fluid mechanics. He also works within multi-objective optimization, data-driven modeling, and intelligent transportation systems. So, Jun, if I could, I'd love to ask you to speak more about your research, but I just can't resist mentioning that one of the areas that you've published on is the very brilliantly named interpretable fuzzy systems. And I was just so interested by this idea, and I'd love it if you could describe what an interpretable fuzzy system is to a lay audience, meaning me. I have a really strong notion that I'm kind of perpetually involved in an interpretable fuzzy system. So I'd love to know what it really actually is, and more about your research in general.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, maybe I will start with fuzzy systems. I mean, it's basically a terminology not very welcomed in industry, because the word of fuzzy, and people think it's fuzzy, it's not precise. That's why lots of industry people think, okay, it's not something precise, so it's going to have some safety concerns. But actually, fuzzy here means you can describe things like a human describe things using the language. So in that sense, it's not as precise as like a numerical computation. So that what does mean by fuzzy. And it's basically one kind of machine learning techniques, but unlike many other machine learning techniques, which is a black box. So basically you have a bunch of input features to describe the system you want to model, and then you can have an output as your predictions for things you are interested to predict, but you don't know what's in the middle. So that's basically like a black box. So in that sense, it's not very easy for people to interpret the model to other person, and in that sense, it's very difficult to validate if the model is actually making sense. And fuzzy systems is good in the sense you can actually describe things in the middle. So what's going on within this model, you can describe it to the person, and it's easy for people to validate and make sense of your model. So maybe just one example, for example, you can use it to predict the travel time of the passengers, or for example, for the aircraft to taxi from the gates to the runway holding points. If it's a black box modeling approach, like many other machine learning techniques, you just throw in lots of inputs like when you are going to departure and what is the current road conditions. And then you will be able to predict what will be the taxi time or travel time, but you don't know what's going on within this model. But with fuzzy systems, you can basically understand, for example, if you're going to departure at the rush hour, and also if the road condition is busy, then the travel time is going to be longer, for example. So you will be able to build this kind of relationships. So in that sense, you can interpret your model. So that gives you two things. One is very good prediction you can utilize to optimize your travel plan, to do the planning for your travel. But on the other hand, you can also understand why you need to travel in this way.
Mm-hmm. And would something like, for example, just as basic as a Google mapping planner be drawing on a fuzzy systems approach to, so in my sort of day-to-day existence, I'm drawing on it all the time when I look at travel times for Google, for example.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if they're using this technique or not, but I think certainly they can also utilize fuzzy as one of the predictive model in their, for example, trip planning engine. Yeah, for travel purpose. Yeah, planning purpose.
And Jun, you work quite a bit with artificial intelligence, and particularly in passenger flow.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, could you talk a little bit about the role of AI in not just in passenger flow, but how you see this, that it might inflect or impact London or other global city transport in the future?
Yeah, I think the AI, I mean, to be honest, I don't know how to define AI because that's a very broad area and very difficult to give a precise definition. But for me, from my perspective, I think AI is something that can behave a bit more like a human behave, and you can make sense of your model if you use data to predict something, so you know what's going on with that model, and then you can utilize that model in an intelligent way for further planning purpose. And also you can consider lots of objectives, for example, when you optimize things. So not only, for example, just travel time, that, for example, Google Map can do as well to optimize your travel time. But also you can consider many other objectives to optimize at the same time. For example, how to reduce the emission. And also, for example, in the current context of this COVID-19 pandemic, how to reduce the risk of contracting COVID-19. So those are all the things we should consider when we travel. And if we can have some digital tools that can intelligently consider all these factors altogether, so that's for me the place for AI to play as well.
Okay, are there any that sounds tremendously exciting, and especially around disease transmission and circulation and planning for that. Are there any downsides that you can see at this point in your research around relying on this?
The downside, I think, I mean, one of the downside is how to consider uncertainty. So because, I mean, when you have the predictive model to give you very precise information or prediction so that you can utilize to further plan the future behaviors, how to build in some uncertainties so that the system you build is going to be resilient. That's something I think very difficult to address. And the other thing is how to explain the system to the practitioners, because lots of machine learning techniques or AI techniques are black box based techniques. So it's very difficult when you build a system and also you can convince practitioners it's safe to use. So that's something I think very, difficult, and it's a grand challenge for us to address.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Jun, I'm aware that Queen Mary has recently launched a very exciting new initiative, which is the Center for Urban Transport Technology, and you're very involved in this as a member of the management team, and Petra is also connected to it as an academic consultant. Could you tell us a little bit more about the center's aims and what its investments in mobility are?
Yeah, this center is a newly established research center and has been recently awarded Center of Excellence status. And we aim to use this center as a research vehicle for the London City Institute of Technology, so which is an institute that is going to be launched very soon, either late of this year or early next year. And Center for Urban Transport Technology, we call it UTT, include external partners of all partners involved in London City Institute of Technology, like anchor employers, Port of London Authority. And currently, this UTT center has 83 academics across 12 different schools from Queen Mary. And we aim to create a community of collaborators within Queen Mary so that together we can address grant challenges across 4 different areas, including aging societies, artificial intelligence and data, clean growth, and future mobilities for different transport modes, including air, road, rail, and water. And we have grouped our research interests into 3 different themes, including component level. So that basically involves everything to do with components like battery, energy storage, and sensors relevant to transport. And then to the vehicle level, so that's everything to do with individual vehicles, how to design, optimize, and control individual vehicles so that we can, for example, reduce emissions. And then to the upper level, which is the system level, so that we can achieve optimization, efficiency at the system level collectively. The overall aim is to reduce the carbon emissions and other pollutants, and also so that we can efficiently use the existing infrastructure and also build future infrastructure to better control and manage the traffic, and also improve the healthy living and healthcare provision, and also to provide next generation of urban transport technology to the society.
That's fantastic. I was particularly interested in one of the aims, in addition to all that you've discussed here, is just that there's a emphasis on aging society and people's ability to access transport with a view to their, in combination with healthcare provision as a perspective. So I just wanted to note to everyone, to the audience as well, how exciting this new initiative is.
Yeah.
And when did it launch, June? Was it this year, just now, or?
This center has been launched already, and we just recently been awarded the research excellence status by QMUL. So it has already been launched, but the Institute of Technology will be launched either later this year or early next year.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Jun. That's wonderful. I'm going to turn now to our third speaker, Louise Webb. And Louise is going to speak also about passenger movement, but from a very different perspective. So Louise works with Go via Thameslink Railway in passenger handling. She graduated from Queen Mary with a degree in drama, and from there went on to station managing Victoria Station with GTR. Following that, she moved to Southeastern Railway, conductor managing, and then became project manager of engineering works. So Louise is currently now project managing the East Coast Upgrade, which is the largest rail engineering works ever. Just extraordinary. So Louise, your role, as you've described it to me, is basically to ensure that passengers easily get from A to B. And that is, as you say, more operations based rather than infrastructure or civil engineering based. I just want to know, like, what's a typical day for you like? And has it radically changed even from last week to this week? Because I'm imagining with like release of the lockdown that something major has happened in your daily life.
Yeah, honestly, Boris Johnson has become a bit of a cuss word in our workplace. It's a bit chaotic sometimes, because for us, as passenger handling managers, we need to understand how passengers are moving. And currently, we have no data to predict that. It moves from day to day, and we have to do a lot of guesswork. So for me, what I do is my main role is making sure that during our engineering works, the passengers that we have on our rail can get to where they want to go. Because in my mind, ultimately, that's what movement is, and that's what transport's there for, because everyone has a goal of where they need to get to. And it's trying to make that as easy as possible. So I'm going to go into like a bit of more of a career talk here rather than anything else, and talk to you about like what project managing within an engineering world looks like. And I thought about it, and I think a lot of managers would agree, the best way to describe it is called herding cats. That you're trying, especially with large projects, you're trying to discuss with as many people as possible what on the page of, you know, what everyone wants to think about. And everyone's got a different idea, especially in the railway, and we all have different knowledge bases. So people tend to wander off in the wrong direction. And as project managers, you have to kind of claw that back with the ultimate aim to make sure that passengers have the easiest way to move from A to B. And so, like, if you ever want to get into project management, I would say that you have to be a brilliant communicator. And especially in the world that we live in at the moment, that's even more so important because the world is changing on a daily basis, more so than it ever has. And the rail has to keep up with that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I'm wondering, when working on the East Coast Upgrade project, the actual rail works, has the pandemic period slightly eased that work for you in the sense that you're not thinking about passenger movement and managing that on a daily basis to the same degree, or is that like a false cognate on my part?
No, you're completely right. So we are looking at the moment around GTR alone, looking around currently 30% of normal passenger rates. So that's significantly reduced. So a lot of our workload has completely changed. And we, the railway, have to be quite flexible with what we do now. So I do different projects internally that are helping helping finance our railway, because we are under something called an IRMA at the moment, and that's called an Emergency Recovery Measures Agreement, which means the government are currently funding us, and it is very, very expensive. If you ever work for us, you'll realise that infrastructure on rail is very expensive and costly, especially for the taxpayer. So my role has to be more flexible. I don't specifically look at passengers anymore because there are less of them. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Louise, I'm dying to ask this question of you. I've just, as myself, someone who works in theatre, I have maybe just an inordinately large interest in how you made this hop from theatre to passenger handling. But in many ways, I was reflecting on this, and we can say that there's certain endeavors and concerns that are really shared by the two fields. Theatre is so much about timings and pauses and tempos of physical movement, and it's also about rehearsals. And I was wondering, it's kind of a two-part question, but firstly, do you draw in your education in drama? I mean, you've spoken about communication being really key. Do you ever draw on strategies and techniques of theatre making at all in your current work? And I was wondering, do you ever rehearse for passenger events?
In the loosest sense, we probably rehearse for events. So, especially during COVID, we have to really assume what's happening, and it really keeps us guessing daily. We don't really have an idea. We can take a good guess, but we don't have an idea of people travelling week on week. And so we use data from our gate lines and our trains to work that out. But as I say, COVID's really thrown that out the window. I mean, the closest thing we have to a rehearsal as such is something called a tabletop exercise, where basically we all sit down and pretend like something dreadful's happened, and we try and resolve it. But I mean, even with that, things have always still gone wrong for us. I think the ones I've got to be very careful here because I'm sure that some of my friends and bosses are on here, but I think the only thing that humanity can agree on is that trains are always delayed. I don't know anyone that doesn't think a train's delayed, and that's what we have to work with. So whenever I'm working on engineering works, there was one time where something just went horribly wrong. Luckily, COVID has helped because we don't have as many passengers. We're on about 20% passenger rate, but still, the trains that were running ended up not having electric. and apparently trains need an electorate to run. And we had so many different problems on the rail that you have to really think on your feet. And, you know, with my drama degree, things have gone wrong in my performances quite often. And you really have to think ahead and think, well, let's pretend that this was meant to happen and kind of move forwards with it. And that's been my thought process for a lot of stuff that I've worked on. I've been thrown into the deep end as well as a station manager at Victoria as well. And that's a process that you always have to deal with. So I think for me, another career advice for anyone that's especially looking for a job now is that don't let your degree define you. Like, if you want to do engineering, that's absolutely fine, and you're an engineer, fantastic, but like, make sure that the degree that you do really helps shape your future. So like, if you're starting to look for a role and position in any sector, look at what skills your degree has offered you. For me, it was confidence, it was presentations, it was speaking to people, and you'll find that there is a massive amount of careers that you can move into with that degree that you have. You learn a lot.
That's brilliant, Louise. That's really inspiring and really bolstering for a lot of us, myself included, to hear. Really, really important advice, and an incredible way to actually segue into our final speaker, Natalie Chung. Natalie is a civil engineer who designed, among other projects, a new railway station in Kent, and was also assistant project manager on HS2 related works. She is also widely celebrated as an ambassador for recruitment to STEM within communities whose progression into the field is often blocked. Natalie was awarded the YMCA England and Wales Young Leader of the Year Award in 2018, the University of Manchester Medal for Social Responsibility in 2019, and Women's Engineering Society Amy Johnson Inspiration Award in 2019 for her volunteer work. So Natalie, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you see these two strands of your work life and your volunteering life intersecting.
Thanks, Molly, and thanks so much for having me on the panel. It's really great to be able to hear from all the speakers, and I'm just really excited to be here, especially talking about transport engineering in particular. So I started my career as a civil engineer in the railway sector, so working for a large design consultancy and helping to sort of bring some of the non-train elements of the railways together. And now I started volunteering, working with young people and outreach, which is really important in the construction and transport sector because it affects the general public, it affects local communities when a massive site is put up in blocking out the railway station or a massive construction site in the middle of the high street. And it's important to engage with the local community on outreach there. And that's something I really like to focus on in my volunteer work, but also in my role now. So working with local schools to help raise young people's aspirations around careers. And initially I chose civil engineering because I wanted to make sure that my work really has that impact on people. And that's also something that comes across in the volunteer work and the work I do now.
Absolutely. At one point you've said that a myth that you really want to bust is that civil engineering is for people who are really good at maths or who love maths. Just wondering what you see as ideal qualities in someone if they're interested in getting into civil engineering.
Yeah, well, I don't think I only said that once. I think I bang on about this all the time. And there's a lot of stereotypes about civil engineering. So there is that one side that I heard a lot from when I was completing my undergraduate studies. A lot of people will say, oh, you study engineering, you must be really good at maths. And there's this expectation that you have to be, you know, absolutely Einstein level in maths or physics or both in order to pursue engineering, which is 100% not the case. But then also there's a completely different counter sort of different stereotype around sort of the industries of transport, construction, civil engineering, railways, where people will be thinking of things like a bus driver or the guys in fluorescent orange from Louise's image just now. And it is always assumed to be men when we know that's not actually the case. And these roles are crucial to the running of the network, but they only represent really a small fraction of the roles in construction, transport infrastructure, civil engineering. Yeah, and there's so many different roles. So I don't know which skill is the most important, but something that I found very powerful, again, to echo what Louise said, is that communication. Because a civil engineer is not just a civil engineering project, you also have to work with the electrical engineers, the mechanical engineers, the town planners, the architects, so many people with different expertise and collaborating together in order to come together and deliver a project. So yeah, being able to work with people of other disciplines is definitely crucial, but we need people with all sorts of skills and experiences in the industry.
Yeah, it seems like, you know, if we're all accessing the products of engineering in our built environments, that it sort of, maybe this is utopian of me to say, but it seems like everyone who's invested in those structures should, their skills, their views, perspectives, and cultures coming into that planning would be really, really important to try to achieve. I'm just wondering if you ever had a situation when you were doing community consultation and talking to communities about what was going to be happening with a new built project. If you ever got someone really excited about civil engineering as part of that process, that you were able to, in a way, recruit or outreach to them in that moment.
Yeah, definitely. I think that outreach is really important because people are curious already to know what's going on when huge construction site boarding is put up, and they want to know how their community is going to be changing when all of these, you know, organizations are setting up camp for sometimes years at a time. And we've definitely seen that with railway projects. It really is years. So something which I find really motivational is when we are able to sort of turn around the opinions of young people. So people of school age who think they have an idea of what an engineer is, but actually we're able to bust a lot of those stereotypes. And the stereotypes that I sort of mentioned before, either that people in the construction industry all do manual labour, or they all need to be really good at maths in order to be an engineer. Both of these very, very different stereotypes, both of them put people off the sector. So kids, even from a really young age, already have it in their head that that career, that field is not for, you know, quote, someone like me. But there really is that opportunity for them, but for different skills, different people to work on these projects. And you're right in saying that it's important that we have a variety, a real diversity of people in those decision-making roles, influencing these projects. Because as with any project, if you were designing an app, you would want to think about how the users would use it, or a website. If you were wanting to go into a community to do charity work, you would want to make sure that your charity work is fulfilling the actual needs of that community. And it's exactly the same with transport projects. Transport is key because it's something which is used by people from all different parts of society. But yeah, definitely being able to bust some negative stereotypes about engineering is what motivates me.
Mm-hmm. And you're also on the Directors Committee for the Women in Engineering Society. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see women's ability to occupy and access public space, if it's helped or hindered currently by transport modes and environments, and where you'd like to see that going.
Yeah, definitely. Oh gosh, this is a big topic, and I know that Molly, this is something that you know a little bit about as well. But what I would say, that here in London, most of the London public transport system, it was sort of designed with that 9 to 5 commuter in mind, so that rush hour commute of going into the city and out again, so A to B, no stops along the way. And not to generalize, but in our society, we know that women are more likely to take up the unpaid caring responsibilities for family members, whether it's children or elderly grandparents or whoever else, regardless of whether or not those women also have a paid job. But in our society, women are more likely to take on these unpaid caring responsibilities. And in these caring roles, they are more likely to not just take a journey from A to B, but actually like A, B, C, D, E. So stop off at a school, then a pharmacy, then stop off at a shop or somewhere else. And the transport system isn't necessarily designed for these journeys. So anecdotally, you may have some experience of this, I know I do, where it can take the same amount of time to commute from Zone 6 in London to Zone 1 in London, because there's a really fast commuter train that has limited number of stops. It takes just as long, if not longer, to get from one place in the borough to another place in the same borough on a bus and by walking, even if the distance in miles is only a fraction. That's just one example that comes to mind, and that does affect sort of gender. And it comes to mind because I've recently been reading Feminist City by this author that we're reading for our book club in the Women's Engineering Society, which I'm glad to be a council member of. So we're reading that this month, and it's really eye-opening, because I had never really thought about how my journeys are affected by this system, because the system has always been like that for as long as I've lived. But yeah, that's just one example, and I'm sure, yeah, it's something that you also know a lot about.
Oh, you've articulated it so, you know, in such important terms there. Yeah, and I think too, well, certainly with the women that I've been working with over the years have experienced, you know, sense of sort of safety and ability to move through public transport systems with confidence is a major issue as well. And of course, financial barriers to getting around to all these different spots, as you've said. I want to just have a look to see about the chat and the Q&A, if we have any questions at the moment. And open it up to the audience, really. If you guys would like to ask anything of our panelists. I, of course, have a couple more questions for you all to discuss.
I don't know if this is the right place, but I think something that I missed when talking myself is about transport of London and how it's changed and the public. And I think Natalie similarly said about movement. And I think we used to think that London was this massive cultural hub, and it's always been a strong economy. But I think was quite a prominent word of that. And, you know, it's always historically been like politics and arts and culture. But I think that COVID has really changed that. It's no longer that commuter force. There's no longer that commuter base. We're seeing a real drop of numbers at GTR specifically, because there's no more commuters. We've got about 20% of people coming into London, and, you know, people are looking for more flexible transport. And I think not only that, but I'm seeing a lot more need for transport more in the north. And because we focused on London for so long, we're seeing the impact of a lack of infrastructure further up. We like to go east to west, especially. So we see projects like HS2 and Crossrail. It's no longer right now needed. You know, we have a small infrastructure that works. So, you know, I think in my world, we need to start looking at ways to really improve that social mobility in different areas of our country, and to really access that severe lack of built infrastructure, definitely. Just thought I'd like to add that as well.
Well, absolutely. Then well, let me open that up to our panelists to respond to Louise on. Petra or Jun or Natalie, have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll definitely like to add, I think that's a really great point, that we haven't seen the same sort of movement or the same sort of urban structure. And I actually think that there's a lot of benefits to that, because even though there's a lot of smaller town independent high streets who have struggled over the last year or so, but there are also some that have really thrived, because people are much more likely to be spending their time in their local high streets rather than the larger centres of cities. And I think that's something which is really great to see, and hopefully we can also follow that up by investment, not just into transport, but also into public spaces. I think that's really crucial to have public spaces which are in people's local communities, not just at the big parks in London, etc.
We've had a question from Jade in the audience. How do you think the London transport sector will change in the next decade?
Do you need to take that?
Sure.
I mean, it's going to change quite dramatically. In all honesty, I can see that most of our transport on rail specifically will be for leisure. We will see a lot more people working more flexibly from home because it has worked. And I think that will be our main struggle for our industry, at least, because a lot of our money comes from commuters. So it's about how do we start gaining money and investment for that leisure travel.
I can certainly share how I hope the industry will change. I would like to see sort of more people from different backgrounds, different experiences in all roles, whether it's engineering, planning, operations, policy making, etc. So that the numbers, Molly, that you mentioned right at the beginning, including that the UK has the lowest numbers of female engineers in proportion with the rest of Europe. I hope to see that will change, and I do see that changing now. But hopefully that will continue and actually continue a little bit quicker. I think it's great to imagine this world where sort of public transport will be used for leisure, as Louise said. And it's strange because the last year when the pandemic has really accelerated that into something that we wouldn't normally have expected. But I think, yeah, the transport can adapt to the needs of the users, and hopefully the industry can be represented of the people who are using the transport as well.
From my perspective, I would think that, well, I'm fairly confident that there would be much more greener ways of going around public transport available in the next 10 years and further.
Yeah, maybe I have one thing to add is, although I agree, maybe there will be a profound change, I mean, after like this pandemic, but on the other side, I do see people going back to like, and also their rush actually into the pre-COVID situation. For example, they're talking about how to book their holiday, even if they know it may not be safe enough. So from that perspective, I think maybe transport is going to be the same in future. So as long as we pass this pandemic, maybe we still have the same problem, like congestion, so many passengers, demand as well. So in that sense, I think maybe in future, we really need to think how to manage passenger flow and how to integrate active travel into the current transport system.
Jun, there's been another question in the panel from I believe my colleague Aoife Monks, ostensibly from myself, but it's from Aoife. She's asking, what will London's transport system look like in 10 years or 50 years in this relationship between COVID and climate change? How would you predict it evolving?
I think certainly there will be more active travel, and especially for a city like London, because you have a very complex transport network. You can use public transport, but at the same time, for part of your journey, you can use active travel, either by walking or by cycling. For me, it's just a matter of how you integrate this active travel into the existing infrastructure, so that people can be encouraged to use those active travel. They don't feel it's like not convenient for them to integrate active travel as part of their journey. That will require quite a lot of changes in terms of decision support system, planning tools, and also infrastructures.
Can I just add a little bit on the climate change notes here, because we expect, of course, more severe climate events to happen in the coming years. And I think one of the more vulnerable parts of London transport system is the trains, actually, with the electric overhead lines. And they are quite, I think, vulnerable to storms. I think we've all had some experience with that before. And as we're expecting probably more severe storms like this to occur, so that is very important that this is also put into the equation and more resilient systems are designed. And I think active transport may be a solution to this, but at the same time, I don't know how many people want to walk or cycle, when there is a huge storm happening.
And then also there's the comment of active travel is actually only really possible in London areas. For the rest of the UK, active travel isn't possible, and we have to still use cars, which are ultimately probably one of the least energy efficient uses unless we start going fully electric. But like you said, Petra, there's issues with sustainability there. I think our company are looking into hydrogen cell buses, for instance. But I think we definitely need to do more and look at quicker how we can improve our sustainability.
And I think the other point is that our society is aging. So obviously not everyone who's quite as able to walk and cycle. So when you have to consider children, elderly people, disabled people, so the transport system has to kind of cater for them as well.
This kind of raises an area that that Jade has asked about again with the follow-up question around you know, a sort of sense that we'll continue to have to make a loss through transport if you know, if we're trying to promote equal opportunity and equal access through transport and infrastructure, but also pursuing environmental goals through sustainable technologies. I feel that there's often this sense, and there is been financial impact in trying to meet those goals. But I also wonder if it's part of the public imaginary that somehow the two are at odds, or we can't possibly finance both in some way. And I wonder, Jade's question is, you know, do you think that transport will need to be a loss-making organization on a regular basis? Is there another way forward, another way of thinking this?
I mean, in my opinion, yes. Short answer, yes. I think there's horrendous statistics out there that, you know, I think the railway is costing £3,000 a minute at the moment to run. It's always been expensive. I think transport takes up about a ridiculous like 20% GDPR of our country. It's always technically been loss-making. So I think we'll just see more of an impact with rail charges. My concern is that it will no longer be socially mobile. People won't be able to afford it. And I think that's probably my main concern in the future, in the fact that it will be loss making, but you know, it will still be expensive, and it already is prior to COVID.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's really easy for me to say because I'm not paying for it. But I do think when you're looking at like the people focused side, I think transport is a really crucial public service. It just happens to be one that we pay for. And it's absolutely crucial for people to access education and employment, or even just for societal structures like seeing friends and family. And without that, if you don't have, you know, the people who are thriving in your city, then your city isn't really great. And I think that's really crucial to think about. But again, I know it's very easy for me to say as I'm not involved in the key decision making about the finances, and that is something which is going to be spoken about, and so it's definitely a massive concern for the wider transport industries.
I'd like to add that I'm not sure if it's necessarily it has to generate a loss, but I think it's not necessarily the question we should be asking. I think we should be just, because we need to consider what transport there is for. And I think Louise and Natalie's already mentioned that this is mostly for moving people, to enabling social mobility, to enabling our lives. So I think we shouldn't consider a loss generated or monetary loss generated from transport as an issue for the society. This should be a service that is being offered to the citizens. And I think in this perspective, then that's the question is quite different. And I think if you're looking at enabling greener technologies, then ultimately the cost of transportation will go down as well, particularly if you can generate electricity from renewable sources. So that would require more of an initial investment into the technologies. But then if you take, like, say, electric cars, and if you generate the electricity from solar power or from wind farms, and of course, ultimately, the cost of the trips would be reduced. So this maybe technology will enable the costs to come down, and that, I am confident that it will. And at the same time, I think it's also just not necessarily something that is an issue if it doesn't, because I think society needs to make sure that the citizens that live in can also have access to these spaces and live a fairly happy life, particularly when we're talking about richer nations who can afford this.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with Petra. There will be room for technology to improve the efficiency of the transport and to reduce the cost. So I can think of one example. There is some brilliant research to basically to investigate how you can efficiently use the energy that has been regenerated by a tube. Because you are going to approach the stop, so you are going to reduce the speed, and then you can regenerate the energy. But if you can better coordinate the other tube, which is going to run in the opposite direction, which is going to accelerate. But if you can coordinate the time so that two tubes can be very close to each other, you will be able to use the regenerated energy from the other for the tube that need to accelerate. So in this way, you can better use energy, and then you can reduce the cost of running. Just one example.
I think that feeds in well to actually a question we've had in the Q&A channel from Susan, which was about asking around the future of the cost of leisure travel, in particular trains, since the UK, she writes, already has very high prices compared with EU countries, and is very, very out of reach, therefore, for many people on low incomes. That's so, yeah, I mean, I think we haven't looked as much around leisure travel in this panel, although Jun, you were mentioning with people deciding en masse to leave the city, you know, as lockdown lifts and so on and so forth, that this is important question around passenger flow and ideas of what's constituting leisure and what's just sort of constituting an idea of freedom of movement for people. Is there anything that you that the panel would like to add around around this question of leisure and resourced leisure travel?
I'd like to maybe add just a little thought, particularly as the EU countries have been mentioned. And I'm sure you've followed the news that in France recently, well, a couple of days ago, they were thinking about it, they were discussing banning all short-haul flights that could be, for distances that could be accomplished within a 4 hour, I think 4 hour? No, maybe 2.5 hours train ride. 2.5, yeah. So, yeah, 4 hours. I was just thinking about going up to Scotland or something. But I think this is a very interesting initiative, and I'm not sure about the statistics in the UK, but I can imagine that there are similar flights that are currently preferred options to train journeys because of the price. But if those flights, for example, would not be possible, then obviously there would be a greater demand on the train journeys, and that could push down prices. And yeah, just to come back to, I suppose, my little dog bone, that would be definitely a greater option from a sustainability viewpoint.
Yeah, I mean, trains will always be subsidised over plane travel. Plane travel is very privatised, where we're still quite a public service. So although I say prices will rise, I think with the world that it is at the moment, train might become more of a viable option, like Petra says. we as an industry need to start looking at how do we entice people into using more leisure travel as opposed to commuting.
Yeah, and just to come in on that, although my answer isn't about leisure travel, but you're right, it says that the cost puts it out of reach for many young people. And something that we've seen in my field is that people will get priced out of going to things like visiting universities for open days or even interviews, also things like job interviews. When young people are considering whether they want to go to college or continue education, further education or higher education, the cost of the travel every day comes into that and can put people off, and they start to think, they start to sort of go towards employment options rather than continuing their education, even if that's what they want to do, because of the day-to-day finances that they'll be having to pay, which is a real shame, and it's not something that we want to do. But there's, you know, as much as we can support, there's definitely people who don't get enough support to access things that they really should be able to access, like job interviews and education. So not to do with leisure travel, but yeah, I think that's particularly key in a way that people of low incomes are priced out. In terms of leisure travel, I would also like to add that the rail travel in the UK is also quite complicated. So there's different prices for, depending on whether you book far in advance or closer to the day of travel, and they do get very extortionate up into the day of travel. It's also complicated with the different types of rail cards that are available, and this is something which, unless you know about it, it can be very confusing, and maybe some of us have been caught out on trains before where you don't have the right kind of train for that train provider, but actually your journey starts and ends in the same place, but because you're not on the right line. I've definitely been caught out in those situations. So I would say that maybe some unity could make it less complicated and therefore entice people more to travel.
Sorry.
Absolutely not your individual fault, but maybe some feedback that you've heard in the past.
Oh, we've heard it once or twice, yeah.
We're coming up to 6:15, so I just wanted to finish on a comment from Liz Tanner that came through the Q&A channel, which is a really wonderful way to end this conversation. Liz writes, the number of women engineers in the UK has been growing over the last 30 or 40 years, and we should note that Queen Mary School of Engineering and Materials Science has a female head of school, and the last president of the Royal Academy of Engineering was Dame Anne Downing. So that's extremely cheering, extremely great to know that we're making progress in that way. And thank you very much, Liz, for bringing that to our attention. Most of all, thank you so much to all of the panelists, to Natalie, Louise, Petra, and Jun. It's been fascinating. These are absolutely crucial questions that we've come a little bit towards trying to think about together and answering together. So I'm just very grateful to you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Molly.
And thank you
so much. Pleasure.
thank you to our audience for the great questions as well.